Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
It's 1991. An old man dressed like a tramp walks into the newly established British Embassy in Latvia. He's carrying a tattered plastic bag stuffed with handwritten notes. His name is Vasili Mitrokhin, and he wants to hand over his life's work to Western intelligence. It's a record of the archives of the KGB. But who was Mitrokhin? Why did he have access to all of the Soviet Union's secrets? And why did he want to give them away? And what happened next? My name is Antonia Senior, and in this episode of the Spymasters podcast, we talk to Gordon Corera, the journalist and writer, about his brilliant new book, The Spy in the Archives. We've got loads of great guests coming up on the podcast, so don't forget to review, like, follow, and don't miss an episode of me talking to all the best writers about spies. Gordon, thank you so much for coming on the Spymasters podcast.
Thank you, Antonia, for having me on.
So we're here to talk about your wonderful book, The Spy in the Archive, about the life and times of Vasili Mitrokhin, a KGB officer turned informant, I guess, for Western intelligence agencies. Now, this is an incredible story. It's one that I kind of knew bits of, but your book brings everything together in the most readable way. Can you tell me why, first of all, you thought it was time to write a book about Mitrokhin?
Well, it is interesting because the broad outlines of his story have been known for some time, since it became public in 1999 with this huge book that came out, co-written by Mitrokhin and Christopher Andrew. And so in some senses, I think a lot of people thought, well, we know this and there's a huge book about it already, but not really about the man himself, not really about why he did it, nor the story of how he got out of Russia, which had never been told before and had been kept, I think, largely secret for many reasons. So there were lots of aspects to this story which I think hadn't been told before. But also, I think, when I look back on it, I thought this is actually a story which matters today and whose importance, I think, had not been appreciated. Because when that book came out in 1999, I think people thought, well, the Cold War is over, Russian spies are no longer a worry, the KGB and everything else is finished. And actually, it's only now, looking at it, a quarter of a century after his book came out and that he went public, that you actually see what he was warning about and talking about. And so actually, I think there's both the human story, but also the sense of importance to his story, which I think made it, to me, something really worth telling now.
I absolutely got that. I mean, we'll talk a little bit at the end about his how he felt towards the end of his life after everything that happened, and how what was happening in modern day Russia feeds into the story that you've written. But that was one of the things I found most fascinating. But let's start from the beginning. Let's start with him. Obviously, he was born in a very different Soviet Union, in a Stalinist Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about his sort of early years? Are quite clouded, aren't they? What do we know about him?
A lot of his life is quite clouded, and that was one of the challenges of writing it. But we know he was born in the early 20s in a small village in Russia, and in the countryside, and from a very ordinary background. So certainly not part of the elite, not educated in a traditional, high-minded academic way. His father had been a decorator, for instance, who'd done some work in Moscow. So in some ways, he'd been a product of the Soviet Union, allowing people to move upwards from these kind of poorer backgrounds in those early days. And I think that was one of the reasons why he starts off as committed ideological supporter of the Soviet Union and of communism. And you can see that through his early life. He's born 1922, so he's just coming of age as the Second World War starts, training as an archivist, and because he loved documents, and that seems to be one of his passions. But then, interestingly enough, he's drawn through the war to becoming a prosecutor, and ends up a prosecutor in Ukraine, and then through that gets this opportunity to join the KGB in the late 40s. And what's interesting is he is still a true believer at this point. He's a believer in the communist system, and he's a believer in the KGB. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about him, is that he starts what is a very long journey. And it's a fascinating journey, a personal journey, a kind of intellectual and also for him a spiritual journey of disillusionment, which starts from the position of being, deeply embedded in the Soviet Union, in the communist world, and in what eventually gets called the KGB itself. And I think that's one of the interesting things about him is where he's coming from, is this youthful faith in the system.
I thought that was so fascinating. And there are a couple of moments for him, aren't there? So the first is that experience in Ukraine, because he seems to have been quite brutalized by what he saw, because there was some quite horrific things happening in Ukraine at the end of the war.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, and he would not really want to talk about it later in life. And he would talk, when he mentioned it to people, he would just say, I saw horrors. And of course, what was happening was at the end of the war, Ukraine had been fought over between, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And some people had fought with the Nazis, and the Soviet Union was trying to reimpose control, get rid of both those who'd supported the Nazis, but also just nationalist resistance. And it was a brutal reimposition of control on Ukraine by the Soviet Union and by Stalin, of which Mitrokhin was a part. And he was part of that as a prosecutor. And the role of the prosecutor was, not to determine innocence or guilt in those days, but just to go through the paperwork, if you like, to prove the guilt that had already been determined for people. So he was, a small cog, but a cog in a very violent, brutal period. And yet, one of the things in which I don't think would ever have acknowledged was that didn't turn him off at this point, because it's still through that he's going to be approached to join. It's not called the KGB, but it is what we think of as the KGB later on in the 40s, just after the war. And so he is still, part of that system at this point, and still embedded in it, and doing pretty dark things which he doesn't want to talk about as part of that system.
And within that, the KGB does offer an amazing opportunity for a young man of no background, doesn't it? Because it gives you access to, becoming part of what is essentially an elite society within Soviet Russia.
Yeah, and that's right. And so it's one of the questions, I kind of asked was, why did he become a KGB officer? And in a sense, it's obvious if you're asked, if there's the opportunity there, if you're, it's an opportunity to join the elite, to get access to the better shops, to the better lifestyle. He's just got married to Nina, and he can offer her something more. But also, I think it offers you a degree of protection by being part of the KGB, and crucially, he's offered, I think, slightly remarkably, the chance to be the first chief directorate of the KGB, or of foreign intelligence. It changes its name around this time, and that is the elite. These are the people who get to go abroad posing as diplomats and spy around the world, but see the world. I mean, you can see the attraction of that for a young man. And yet, I think he, I was looking at some of the sources from that time, and one of the things they do note is that, they were short of people at that point after the end of the war, because so many had been killed and so many had been pulled into other things. And so, the KGB or Soviet intelligence, domestic and foreign, is growing at that time. And I think he is an example of someone who got in who perhaps wasn't necessarily that well suited to, the overseas spying part of it, and yet, is offered that opportunity and takes it willingly.
Although he makes a bit of a cock up of it, doesn't he? I mean, that's clear.
And that is the key. I think that's one of the keys to his story. And again, it's another thing which he didn't like to talk about very much. But he doesn't prove a very good spy in the kind of classic sense of spy, of someone who goes abroad and does the, tries to, sidle up to a British diplomat on the cocktail circuit. That was not the kind of person he was. He was quite introverted, quite difficult, not sociable. He certainly wasn't clubbable with his colleagues. He didn't know how to play the games of the Lubyanka, of the headquarters, and to get ahead and get the right patrons. He would speak out too much, and his foreign assignments don't go well. He was in Israel at a time when a big ring of spies the Soviet Union was running gets busted. Whether he was directly responsible for that failure, it's not entirely clear, but it certainly doesn't go well. He then also will do he does a series of short-term postings after that rather than long-term postings. And one of them is during the Olympics in Melbourne in Australia in 1956. And again, this goes badly wrong. And talking to people who've worked on this, it was very interesting. It's a very good author, Harry Blutstein in Australia, who helped me with this. But, it looks like Mitrokin himself was responsible at the poolside for a disastrous moment where there's a fight between the Soviet and the Hungarian teams, because Hungary's just been, the Hungarian uprising has just happened in 56 at the time of the Olympics. And the two teams are literally fighting and it gets out of control. And Mitrokin was there as one of the KGB officers kind of supposed to be keeping an eye on it, and clearly fails. And so it is after these kind of failures that, his file is stamped with, not suitable for operational work. And where do they send him? The archives, and it's partly because you don't sack people very, lightly, but the archives, and they probably thought, well, here's a guy who studied archives, when he was younger. Let's just put him in the archives where he can become as one person, but a clerical rat, just kind of doing the most mundane bureaucratic job. Can't do any harm there. and it's a fascinating moment because, of course, that starts his journey of disillusionment. And one of the things that I find interesting, and it's always interesting with spies, trying to untangle where grievance and ideology, entangle themselves. And with him, clearly he was aggrieved because he thought he was going to be this great foreign spy, and instead he's sent in the archives. But then what he sees in the archives over years will in turn change him.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because he's sort of buried in these archives, but he's seen the West now, right? So he's seen already that there's a problem with truth telling, right? Because this becomes a massive part of his story, doesn't it? His perception of the lies being told, and I guess the fact that he's been abroad and he's seen seen the evil capitalist empires for his own self, and seen that actually there's a standard of living there that you can only dream of in the Soviet Union. Although his everything is infused by this slightly bizarre Russian nationalism rather than a kind of addiction to liberal capitalism.
Yeah.
So I found that so interesting that he'd sort of seen beyond the world, and then suddenly his horizons shrink to this incredibly small arc.
Well, yeah, and I found that fascinating as well, because it is someone who then lives in the files and who's seeing the world through the files. And it's an odd way to see the world, isn't it? Through the lens of what the KGB is doing to the rest of the world. That if that is your only understanding of how society works, it is what that does to him is very complex. And there's also a complex interaction, I think, between events that are going on in the outside world and what he's seeing in the files. So, a good example, and one of the key moments will be the Prague Spring of 1968, where he is, at that time, he's doing a brief posting for a couple of years. He's working in the archives in East Germany for the KGB. And he's seeing what the Soviet Union is doing, and the attempt to have a more reformist, open, liberal, open-minded communist system being crushed by the KGB. And he can also, because he is inside the KGB, see how they are doing that and see that they're planting false information, see that they're trying to frame some of the leaders of the revolution as Western agents when they're clearly not. He can see how the KGB's resources, what is supposed to be a foreign spy service, is actually being used against the Soviet bloc itself and against the Russian people and against the Czechoslovak people and others. And that, again, furthers his disillusionment. And so, your point is important, that he had seen the outside world, but he wasn't a Western liberal. And I think we sometimes want to think that, people who will become disillusioned with, being inside something like the Soviet Union, therefore must turn to Western liberalism. That was absolutely not really the case with Mitrokhin. It was more complicated than that. He was, in essence, always a Russian patriot and to some extent a Russian nationalist who came to see that the Russia he loved was being exploited and damaged and corrupted by this force, which was, in his mind, a kind of a creature. I mean, he came to see it almost as a physical creature, one of whom's expressions was the KGB and this idea of Czechism, the Cheka being the original name for the secret police. And he saw this as a kind of corrupting force, destroying his country, which he wanted to take on and fight. And the way of fighting it was to tell the truth about it, or at least to record the truth about it. And that's this journey that he goes on while he's in the archives, a very lonely, kind of spiritual, solitary, intense journey.
It was so interesting the way that developed, and you felt almost like there was an edge of madness to it, because the way you describe it in the book, his hatred of the organization he's working for becomes kind of visceral. He sees it as you say, as this kind of beast. He sees himself as wanting to slay it, and so he kind of maniacally writes down everything he can. But at this point, with no end, like he doesn't know what he's going to do with all this stuff. So maybe, before you tell me what he thinks he's doing, what exactly is he doing? What's the logistics? He's in the archive. What are the logistics of him getting the information out?
So it's worth saying that this is a journey, and 56, he's into the archives. By 68, he is really turning against it, that time of the Prague Spring, and begins to visualize this kind of creature, and he sees it as a hydra, like a dragon with 3 heads, and it is that slight spiritual fervor that he has, one of the heads being the Communist Party, another being the nomenclatura, the elite, another being the KGB, and this creature he wants to destroy. But he's still not doing anything about it until 1972. So you've already got this years long journey. Then in 1972 a key moment comes, because he's risen up the ranks of the archivists to one of the more senior archivists by this point. And crucially, the KGB is moving house. So the first chief directorate, the bit that does the foreign spying, moving out of Lubyanka in central Moscow, out to Yasenevo, the woods or the forest out on the outskirts. And they're going to have their own kind of new compound, which is still where the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service is based. And that means moving the files. So you've got to move the entire archive of the first chief directorate. And he is one of those in charge of that. So what that means is all the files that are going to be moved are going through his office. And he has his own office, and he sees this. He realizes this is his opportunity. So he's got to look at the files in order to decide which ones move, which ones could maybe be destroyed, which ones go where. And he starts copying them. I mean, at first he tries to memorize it and then reconstruct them from his memory when he goes home. Then he realizes he can copy it on tiny bits of paper, folds up the paper and puts it in his shoe and walks out at the end of the day. And there's lots of amazing things about this. I mean, it's amazingly brave. Of course, he knows the security procedures, and he knows you can't steal a file. You can't, you'll get checked if you're carrying out some big file stamped secret. But if you copy it down over years, you can extract and copy the crucial bits of the archive. So he copies it down in his own special code on tiny bits of paper, and then at home in his apartment, and on the weekend at his dacha, he'll reconstitute a file from his code and write it up, and then eventually put it on a typewriter, and then bury those under the floorboards of his dacha in milk churns to keep them safe. And it's an extraordinary thing to do. It is also extraordinary because at this point, he is not, if you like, a spy. As you said, he's not worked out what he's going to do with it. It's not like he's contacted MI6 or the CIA who said, could you do this? Or that he's even got a plan to contact them. And, again, one of the things that I found very interesting was this idea that he was he was following in a tradition to some extent of Russian Soviet writers who wrote for the drawer, as they put it. In other words, you would write and put it away in a drawer, not knowing when or how it would be published, but because you felt compelled to write and record it. And Mikhail Bulgakov had done this with The Master and Margarita over many years. Solzhenitsyn would do it with the Gulag Archipelago and would write without knowing how it would be published or when it would be published, because you knew it was too dangerous at that moment. But this kind of compulsion to record the truth and have it there as an act of rebellion was what was driving him. And he would do that for 12 years until he retired in 1984.
It's absolutely amazing. I found that really moving. The idea that, he had a kind of idea that somehow the truth mattered, even if the truth was buried in a milk can underneath his dacha. I thought that was extraordinary.
And I found it amazing, really, thing to do. I mean, and just this faith that the truth, that he had a sense of mission, and purpose to do that, without knowing how to get it out or even that it ever would be. So this amazing thing where you've got, the most secret files of the Soviet Union copied down, just sitting under his floorboards. It's bizarre and remarkable and brave.
It's absolutely amazing. And so just jumping forward, obviously then the Soviet Union collapses and then there's an opportunity for him to get this stuff out. But it's still a leap, right? It's one thing having this stuff under the floor of your dacha. It's another thing doing what he decides to do, which is to give that information to the countries that have effectively been your country's enemy for your lifetime.
I agree. And after he retires in 1984, he does start to think about what he could do with it. And he's wondering, how do I get it out? But by this time, it's boxes and boxes and boxes. It's not something one individual could carry out easily, or cross a border with. And, he's ex-KGB. He knows the borders are monitored. So it's only when the Soviet Union effectively collapses that he sees an opportunity at last, having tried to think in his head in a slightly, febrile way how to do it. He suddenly realizes now an opportunity, because in the Baltic states, formerly part of the Soviet Union, now independent, Western embassies have been opened up, but they're also accessible from Russia because the border controls are so weak. So he realizes that, and at the start of 1992 decides he's going to go there with a sample of his wares and approach. And he approaches, it's amazing. He approaches the Americans first, and they just don't realize, and this was part of the story. I spent a lot of time trying to reconstruct, talking to Americans about it, who were a bit shy because they made a mistake, in the CIA, because, they turn him away multiple times, and one of the reasons is they've got a lot of walk-ins. Another reason is he's deliberately dressed down to look like a tramp because he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. So they just see this grubby old man who looks like a tramp, wheeling a shopping bag along, claiming he was the KGB archivist. And they're like, yeah, whatever.
And then he just pulls some tatty old handwritten files or hand-typed files out of the bag. I mean, you can understand why they were...
Yeah. And the files, of course, because if you go back to what we were talking about earlier, the files aren't stamped top secret. They are not, if you like, original KGB files. They are what he has written up from it. So you can't even see that they are originals. They're just notes. So it's only when he then goes to the British embassy in Vilnius in March 92 and knocks on the door, kind of cold calls, asks to see someone. And interestingly enough, there's a young woman there who is a diplomat, quite junior, but who served in Moscow, who speaks Russian, and who offers him a cup of tea and has a look at the files and just senses there is something interesting about this. Maybe this guy is for real. She's not MI6, she's not a spy, but she will take, effectively just take that chance on him, which the Americans hadn't. And then in turn, a message will get back to MI6. Maybe there's someone you want to come and take a look at. He's coming back, in April. Do you want to come and meet him?
I absolutely loved the bit in your book where you talk about the two MI6 officers who are assigned to handle the case and their relationship with each other. And one of them is Robert, who is basically like a KGB whisperer. Like, I love the idea that he can just sort of sniff out a KGB guy. So James and Robert go to Vilnius and they meet him. And Robert kind of takes a look at him and goes, yeah, KGB. Amazing.
Yeah. It's Robert. What's interesting is Robert is Russian. And I was quite surprised by this, that that MI6 would be employing someone. He's effectively an agent for MI6, but he is a very well established, and very useful person for MI6, because he speaks Russian, and not just speaks it, but he has a feel for Russian, because he's lived there. He's dealt with the KGB when he was in Russia. So he has this, he has what people describe to me as a superpower where, he could just meet someone and go, yep, they're KGB, they're for real. And that's what he does with Mitrokhin. And then this starts a series of meetings, which I recount in the book and which I found fascinating, in which they're trying to work out, is he for real? He's giving them some files. He's making demands of what he wants. And this process will go on over months, effectively, as they try and negotiate and work out what to do with him and what he wants to do, because they quite quickly realize he is not easy to handle. He's not an easy man.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that. That comes across very strongly too. I mean, there's no reason to expect him to be an easy man, but I mean, he was obviously quite difficult to deal with.
Yeah, he was. And going back to what we've already talked about, a normal person wouldn't do that kind of stuff, wouldn't take those risks. He was a driven, unusual, introverted, difficult person. I think there's no way of hiding that, and that's the reality of spying. The idea that it's always simple, these people, but they have complicated motives. So he is hard for them to handle, and he makes a series of demands, including that he wants his whole family to be extracted when it's time, and that he wants his archive to be published, which is kind of pretty unusual, and MI6 isn't normally a publishing agency, but that is his demands, and he's absolutely firm on his two demands, and he's basically saying, I won't give you the files and more of the files unless you agree to this. So, there's a bit of improvisation from MI6 and the officers who are in the field, which is, I guess, what they're paid to do. But eventually, they agree to that and make the deal.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
They get him and his family out, and I think we should encourage people to read about that in the book, because it's so brilliantly written. It's almost comedic. They're getting the
wild story. Yeah. Read the we won't retell it here, but it's almost the most exciting and slightly fun and slightly crazy bit of the book.
Yeah, it's completely mad, and I encourage everybody to read that bit with their mouth open like I did. Obviously, they now have access to these incredible treasures. But the other thing that I found really interesting was that right from the beginning, there's a tension in the relationship with Western intelligence agencies. So the CIA get involved now, a bit embarrassed that they let the Brits get the lead. But there's an automatic tension because his interest is in the KGB crushing of internal dissent. And the Western intelligence agencies don't really care about that. They care about the fact that there is so much information in his files about spying on the West, about the great illegals, about all the operations that have been run about the West for 50 years. So there's right from the beginning, there's a kind of potential tension there, isn't there?
Yeah, and you're right. The tension there, it's there with the Western intelligence agencies, because what they are interested in is if what they would call counterintelligence. Where are the spies in the West that the KGB has planted? Whereas Mitrokhin is really, what he cares about is, here is this beast he's been fighting, which has destroyed Russia and has been feeding off the Russian soul. They're not really interested in that. And then, of course, when they're moving on the process towards publishing the book in 1999, again, if you're writing a book for a Western audience which has got to sell, people are interested in the kind of classic spies of the Cold War. They're not interested in, kind of complicated operations run about dissidents inside Russia or who are in the Soviet bloc and who illegals are working against. So this tension starts to develop, and I think becomes quite difficult for him, and he becomes frustrated and very frustrated over the years. His material will be used for prosecutions in the US particularly, but at one point he says, I don't want to go, I don't want to go and testify in these prosecutions. These are kind of cockroaches. I'm trying to fight something else. So there's a frustration there, and there's a difficult relationship with MI6. Through to the late 90s, there's a difficult relationship with his co-author Christopher Andrew when they're working together on this book, and it becomes a very, very difficult process again, which goes back to his character and his personality and his drive and why he had been doing it. And I found that really interesting as well, because the story certainly doesn't stop after his exfiltration. It almost takes another twist and a turn in his story.
Oh, it absolutely does. It's completely fascinating. And again, kind of heartbreaking, because his motivation as a sort of champion of kind of truth and justice, like working on his own all those years, and then he gets to the West and they just don't really care about the science fiction-ish kind of crusade. That's not what they're in for.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think, this is the slight tragedy of his story, is that he did something remarkable, which I think was hugely important and which did change the world in many ways and revealed lots of things about the KGB and what they'd been up to. And yet he can also see in this period of the 90s and into the early 2000s that his enemy is not defeated. So everyone else thinks, well, the Cold War's over. 91, Soviet Union is gone. The KGB has gone. It's changed names. It's the FSB at home, SVR abroad. But everyone seems to think, well, spies, spying, Cold War, Russian spies, doesn't matter anymore. Even the fact Vladimir Putin comes along in 1999, being elevated to the leadership of Russia. And yes, he's a KGB man, but everyone thinks, he's someone we can do business with. He's going to bring order and stability after a chaotic 90s. And yet Mitrokhin can see the danger. And he uniquely can see there is a danger to this. And of course, he can see it because he understands it, because he's lived in the belly of the beast. He understands the KGB, this world of the Czechist, in a way that I think no one else can. And certainly others in the West couldn't. And certainly even Western intelligence couldn't. And yet he could see it. And you can sense this frustration to him in his later years, in his last years in Britain, as he's trying to warn people and to ring the alarm bells. And I'm not sure people listened, which again is why I thought going back to the story is so important.
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And he, in fact, I just to quote you back at you, you write in your book, as he watched his homeland change, or as he saw it fail to change, there came a loss of faith in what was possible. And then a quote from him: the Russians have had enough experience of the past to know that there is no, actually, I've written it down badly. I can't read my own, my own handwriting. There is no future for a country of slaves and masters. And I thought, God.
Yeah, and I think he saw that. He came to think that there was something wrong, had gone wrong with Russia. And that it was a country which could only work with slaves and masters, and the masters who were going to oppress the slaves, the ordinary people. And he came to kind of slightly despair about that and the hope that it might change. And, he came to see the beast that he'd been fighting kind of reconstitute itself in a different way. And, I did find it sad, and that explains some of the kind of tensions and some of the frustrations. And if you read his final writings, which were particularly in a book called Czechisms, which, and again, the fact it's called Czechisms, it's about the Czechists, the Czechists being the original name for the Soviet secret police. And this was the force that he could see having persisted, through the different name changes like the KGB, and this force having persisted. But if you look at his notes there, you can sense, this desperate drive to still try and tell people the truth and to believe that the files that he'd copied down did contain a truth, which if people would only listen to, they would understand, warned them about something that was still there in Russia.
Yeah, I suppose because the Hydra that you talk about him identifying with the kind of three heads, and it's the Communist Party, the KGB, and the non I can't say it. The elite. In Putin's Russia, one of those heads is gone, but it's still the Czechists and the elite, but with just more money, right? So it's.
It's very interesting because in his mind you had these three heads, the Communist Party, the elite, and the KGB, and they all kind of tussled with each other. Actually, if you look at Soviet history, that actually the KGB and the Communist Party were always kind of slightly rivaling each other. I mean, about this, Antonia, for kind of superiority. And at first, he sees in the 90s, he thinks, well, the Communist Party is gone, but the two remaining heads, the Czechists, are now subordinate, to the kind of nomenclature which had become the Russian mafia, the oligarchs who had taken over the country and who'd become fused with organized crime. And that's how he sees it. But then by the 2000s, you see another shift in which actually the KGB, Czechists, Vladimir Putin, have become the dominant ones and have subordinated even the oligarchs and this nomenclature, this elite, to them. So there's a shift. He sees the shifting power between his enemy and it change, but he still sees this persistence of the one strain, which is the Czechists, all the way through. And I think he could see Putin clearly in a way very few people could in the early 2000s.
Absolutely. In terms of the stuff that he actually brought out, in kind of reverting to the positive, because obviously you can see how disappointed he was. For the Western intelligence agencies, this was like Christmas, right? I mean, they were astonished by what came out.
Yeah, and they were astonished because the volume of it was just extraordinary. And I think this is why he is one of the most important figures, to understand the Cold War, because he just paints this picture of KGB operations influence agents across the world. So it's not, you get other agents who have a good insight into what was happening in Britain or America or somewhere, but he's got this kind of insight into what was happening in Africa, in India, in Britain, in America, in Latin America, and just the files and files of it, which reveal the truth about what the KGB had been doing and about the agents and who had been working with them, who'd been in contact with them. So it is a treasure trove. I mean, occasionally it was almost embarrassing and difficult because of the scale of it. And this is one of the, interesting facets of it, which I found was that, for sometimes it's not very comfortable being told, you had a load of spies who you hadn't spotted, who the KGB had run. Because if you're MI5 or the French, security service, being told, here's a bunch of spies who, may be retired now, but who were actually quite dangerous. It's like, oh boy, what do we do about that? Do we prosecute them? Is this evidence? How do we use it? Isn't it going to be quite awkward? People are going to ask questions about why we didn't catch them before. And so there's actually a kind of, it becomes, in some countries, France is a good example where there are hundreds of agents who Mitrokin exposes. It's quite difficult, some of those conversations. In other countries, it becomes very political. So if you take Italy and India, to take two examples, it showed quite extensive contacts between the KGB and certain political parties. And in both of those countries, it then becomes a kind of political tool by other parties who use, the evidence of Mitrokin in his archive to say, look, our opponents were, communist or KGB stooges. So, the ripple effects are complicated in different countries and in different ways around the world. And in the UK, for instance, when the book comes out in 1999, it's overshadowed by the story of Melita Norwood, who was one particular spy who'd been working as an atomic spy, in the British atomic weapons program at the early Cold War, and had given secrets to the KGB, and who MI5 had investigated a little but effectively missed, and who's still alive when the book comes out, and is a grandmother in Bexley Heath in the suburbs of London. And so it becomes, again, the question becomes, well, why wasn't she prosecuted? Why wasn't anything done about it? And this is one of the problems for Mitrokin in his archive, again, is that, those stories overshadow the story he wants to tell.
I think people will be astonished reading your book, though, how few people were actually held to account or in any way after his revelations, let alone prosecuted. I mean, can you just elaborate a little bit on how difficult it is for counterintelligence to actually pin anything on people, even when they know?
Yeah, because one of the questions was, so Mitrokin might have noted down this person was a KGB spy. But is that evidence which you could take to court? I mean, one of the problems was, were his notes, they're not original documents. As we said, they're his write-up of the documents. So there was a kind of question mark, often that he would point to someone and provide, evidence, and sometimes quite detailed evidence, code names, passport numbers, to show someone had been a spy for the KGB. But was that sufficient to prosecute them? And what you see, particularly in some of the American cases, is they end up having to find other ways, often through, the FBI will do what's called a false flag. They will, and they'd been told that someone had been a KGB spy by the Mitrokin Archive, and then they would approach them. And, for instance, an FBI agent who spoke Russian would pretend to be a Russian intelligence officer trying to reactivate them, get them to confess and acknowledge that they had been a spy, and therefore get the evidence that could be admissible in court. So they have to go through these kind of procedures to deal with it. And it's hard. And in many cases, and in some countries, they basically just decide this is just too awkward. We're not going to take action on this, because it's too damaging, too embarrassing to do it, as well as too difficult. So yeah, it's really surprising in a way that more wasn't done with the archive in terms of prosecutions. But I think it was difficult.
I mean, in Britain, it's up to a journalist to actually go to Melita Norwood after which it was extraordinary. But that's not the only instance amongst the British revelations where you get the sense that the British didn't quite know what to do with the information, or but how much is that sort of legal nicety, and how much is that cover up, and how much is it just awkwardness? I mean,
I think, and there's a mix to it, and I think with Melita Norwood, it was a mixture of embarrassment because they'd investigated her and not spotted how serious she was. There was a worry about, if we're seen as prosecuting a granny, for something she did 50 years ago, how's that going to look? I also think it goes back to that thing about the 90s, though. This is all happening in the 90s. If you look at governments, they were in the mindset the Cold War is over. If our that old Cold War spying stuff is history, if you're MI5, you're being asked to look at, Northern Ireland, at terrorism, at new threats or organised crime. And so kind of spy hunting, and worrying about Russian spies was seen as something for the dinosaurs or for the obsessives, even within MI5 and MI6 and the FBI and the CIA, and not core business anymore, because Cold War was over. Russia were kind of our friends now. So there was also a kind of political overlay, which made people less willing less wanting to understand that than maybe if it had happened, 10 years earlier when the Cold War was still going.
I thought one other nugget I found fascinating was the reaction within the Soviet intelligence when they started understanding that there'd been this massive leak. And at first they couldn't understand it because they were like, well, how can there be all these names? Because only one, you'd only have access to a tiny portion of what appears to have been leaked. And then they because it didn't occur to them that the unassuming clerical rat who'd had access to everything was the culprit.
Yeah, and I think they're in denial at first because they go, well, this just isn't possible that someone's all these files. It's just not possible. And also they think to themselves, well, we'd have spotted it if someone had stolen files. But of course, it goes back to the idea he hadn't stolen them, he'd copied them. And even more amazingly, Mitrokin is retired in 84, as I said, and he leaves in 92, and he's retired. And I think they don't actually realise he's gone. I mean, this is what I think one of the wildest bits of the operation is MI6 realised, because he's living mainly this kind of quite solid, I mean, admittedly with his family, and they've got a couple of dachas, country houses or cottages really, and an apartment in Moscow. They kind of make it look like he's always somewhere else. And so they've never missed him. And so I think it does come as a genuine shock to Russian intelligence when they realise their archivist has gone, and he's gone with, all their deepest secrets, for decades.
Were there, I mean, I know that there were initially some concerns about reliability, because obviously they were relying on, these weren't original documents. This was his recreation of the documents. How much of those kind of concerns about reliability being laid to rest now? I mean, how accurate do we think all of this is?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think there is an acknowledgement that you cannot prove 100% accuracy with it, but because he is copying it, and he had a photographic memory, so down passport numbers and things like that. But of course, it's impossible to prove because you don't have the originals to go back and compare it to. Now, one of the things, we know, and MI5 and MI6 were quite quickly able to know the archive was real. When he first comes out with the samples in 92, he's got details of, for instance, deep cover Russian illegal spies who'd been operating in Britain, who had never been made public, but who MI5 had discovered. So MI5 were able to look at it and go, hang on a sec, this is, his documents are real because we can see that he's got the details of people who no one else knew about other than us and obviously the KGB. So they are convinced of the general authenticity of his archive very, very quickly. But that is different from being able to know that every detail is correct. And of course, it could be copying down incorrectly, but also the reality of archives. And, I think this is one of the things, people need to bear in mind, and anyone who's worked in archives like yourself knows this, is that, sometimes, intelligence files can be wrong. And also, intelligence officers can shade the truth in their files. So, you might get a KGB officer who's going, yeah, I've recruited Antonia, over lunch, and she's now my top agent. But you're just thinking, well, I just had a nice lunch with Sergei. And, and he's writing it up as if it's, and you get that in files. Sorry, I'm not suggesting you have been recruited by.
Sadly, not yet. I'm still waiting.
But you know what I mean? But so you get that kind of exaggeration in files as well about agents and their status, sometimes by intelligence officers who are in the KGB trying to, overdo their successes. So when someone is listed as an agent, are they definitely an agent? Again, there's a complexity to that, which you have to acknowledge when you're dealing with archives. That even if it's in the secret KGB archive, is that necessarily absolutely the full truth? No. So there is a complexity to it. I think you have to acknowledge that, and it is not as simple as just saying everything in there is perfect truth. It's not like that.
I've got Christopher Andrew Mitrokhin's book on my desk, and it's like the size of a small dog. It's enormous. There's so much there. Yeah. Is there anything that you would particularly pick out as being like specifically groundbreaking as a legacy?
Well, I think you're right that the Christopher Andrew book is an amazing book with Mitrokhin, but there is so much in it. That is one of the problems. Is that, you look at one page and you'll read it and you go, well, that's a fascinating story. And there's, one page on it. And the truth is that's because he had so much material to go through and to try and compress it in a book. But if you go back, and the key thing is the files are there in Churchill College, Cambridge. You can go look at them. Yeah. You can go and see the raw files. I mean, they're in Russian, but you can get them translated or translate them yourself. And the details are amazing. And so that what appears as one page in that book, there'll be a rich story behind it. And there's just pages and pages of great details. And I think, what's been interesting is in the last 10, 20 years, you've seen specialist researchers go into that archive and pull out some amazing stories. And I've seen it, journalists from Israel, journalists from, Armenia, who've gone and said, I'm going to look at the, specifically at the files on this. And they found riches in there. And so there are still, amazing, rich stories, from the Mitrokin archive, which are there to be mined, I think, by those who want to do it, all thanks, to the work of this remarkable and slightly odd archivist.
That's amazing thoughts to end on, the idea that all the riches are yet to be fully explored.
Yeah,
I need to go and learn Russian.
I know. Go and delve into the archives, but it's a nice way of, that's how that's why he did something remarkable, which I think, we should be grateful for, that he exposed, what the KGB was doing, and this legacy, and the legacy really is there in the files for people to see and to work on, and will be there for years to come.
And especially, just as a final point, because in Putin's new Russia, there was a moment where some of these archives were open. I mean, heavily sort of policed and redacted and whatever, but these archives were momentarily open, but the shutters have come down again. So this is our best.
Yeah. It is our best source on what the KGB was up to. In some cases, it is the only source, because it's thought some of the files were actually destroyed, the original files, at the end of the Soviet Union to protect them. And so the only source we may have on some of these operations and some of these individuals lie, in what Mitrokin copied down and took out.
It's just an incredible story and so brilliantly told. I know it's an overused trope that a non-fiction book about spies reads like a thriller, but this reads like a thriller.
Thank you, Antonia. It's really good to hear, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did so much. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spymasters podcast.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here, wishing you a very happy half-off holiday, because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. And Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day, yeah? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.